Still, it was hard to believe anyone would make a big deal over a few flowers. Life went on. Work, bills, coffee with friends. But the feeling of peace that came with the house began to fade. The neighborhood, once friendly and warm, started to feel watchful, like every move she made was being judged through half-closed blinds. Then came the meeting notice. A letter in her mailbox, sealed with the HOA logo, inviting all residents to a mandatory community review. Evelyn didn't think much of it until she read the agenda. At the top of the list, discussion of property violations, Lot 27. Her address. That night, she couldn't sleep. She replayed every detail in her head. The flowers, the trash cans, even the slightly faded paint on her fence. Was that it? What could possibly justify a review of her home? Something told her this wasn't about rules anymore. Something else was going on, and she was about to find out just how far her HOA was willing to go to keep control. The night of the HOA meeting came faster than Evelyn expected. She walked into the clubhouse, clutching a folder of house documents just in case she needed to defend herself. Inside, the atmosphere felt less like a community gathering and more like a courtroom. Plastic chairs lined the walls, and a folding table at the front held the HOA board. 5 members, all with identical expressions of cold politeness. At the center sat Carolyn, the HOA president. Her voice carried the kind of tone people used when they believed they were doing something noble, even when they weren't. The meeting began with small updates, landscaping schedules, parking enforcement, and community event budgets, before Carolyn's voice suddenly sharpened. "Next item," she said, tapping her pen, "Lot 27, property violations." A murmur rippled through the room. Evelyn could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. Carolyn began listing issues in a calm, rehearsed tone. The wildflowers by the mailbox, the faded fence paint, the non-standard solar lights lining Evelyn's walkway. None of it seemed serious, yet the way Carolyn spoke made it sound like a scandal. Then came the line that changed everything. If these violations continue unresolved, the HOA board will have to pursue enforcement action, including legal remedies, to bring the property into compliance. The words legal remedies hit like a punch. Evelyn had never imagined something as small as flowers could turn into a legal threat. When she tried to speak, Carolyn smiled thinly. "You'll have a chance to address the board in writing," she said, cutting her off. "Thank you for your time." The meeting ended, but the tension had just begun. Over the next few weeks, the letters started arriving. At first, they were simple warnings, a request to remove the flowers, to repaint the fence, to restore community uniformity. But soon, the tone shifted. Each envelope was heavier, the language colder. Violation notice, failure to comply, additional fines applied. Evelyn paid the first fine, hoping it would end things. But when another letter followed, this one for a cracked driveway tile she hadn't even noticed, she began to realize this wasn't about rules. It was about control. The wildflowers were gone now, replaced by dull green shrubs that matched every other house on the block. Yet, somehow, the HOA still found new problems. A wind chime deemed too loud, a bird feeder encouraging pests. Each notice chipped away at her peace until her own home began to feel like enemy territory. Bailey, her dog, seemed to sense it too, barking at shadows near the fence at night, whining when mail arrived. And then one morning, Evelyn woke to find her fence gate slightly open. Footprints in the damp soil led up to her garden bed. Someone had been there. She called the HOA to report it, thinking maybe they'd help, but the board brushed her off. Carolyn's voice was calm on the phone. "Perhaps if your property were in full compliance, people wouldn't be so concerned about it." That was the moment Evelyn stopped believing the HOA was just doing its job. The harassment escalated. Anonymous notes appeared in her mailbox. "Why can't you just follow the rules?" And "You don't belong here." Her trash cans were mysteriously knocked over. A fine for noise disturbance arrived even though she lived alone and worked late-night shifts. When she requested a copy of the HOA's bylaws, they ignored her emails. When she asked for proof of her supposed violations, they said the records were confidential. Evelyn began keeping everything. Every notice, every letter, every voicemail. She created a binder thick with evidence. She didn't know what she would do with it yet, but something deep inside told her this wasn't going to stop until she fought back. The breaking point came 2 months later. She returned home from a night shift to find a bright orange notice taped to her front door. The words at the top made her stomach drop. Final notice, non-compliance, legal action pending. The letter claimed she owed over $4,000 in accumulated fines. If she didn't resolve the matter, the HOL would place a lien against her property, meaning they could, in theory, take her home. Her hands trembled as she read it again and again, hoping it was a mistake. But at the bottom, in Carolyn's looping signature, it was clear. This was deliberate. They weren't just enforcing rules anymore. They were coming for her. Desperation turned into determination. Evelyn began digging. She researched the HOA's authority, state property laws, and homeowner rights. The more she learned, the more she realized how often HOAs crossed legal lines, using intimidation and false fees to pressure residents into compliance. When she found out that Carolyn had personally approved several unbudgeted landscaping contracts, all paid through HOA funds, something clicked. This wasn't about flowers, fences, or driveways. It was about power and money. She reached out to other neighbors quietly, wondering if she was the only one being targeted. What she discovered shocked her. 3 other residents had similar stories: random fines, property threats, and ignored appeals. But they were too afraid to speak up. "Carolyn makes life miserable for anyone who questions her," one whispered. "It's easier to just pay and keep quiet." Evelyn refused to be quiet. She filed a formal complaint with the County Housing Authority and sent copies of every letter and fine she had received. Within weeks, an investigator reached out, confirming that some of the HOA's actions looked procedurally irregular. But when word got back to the board that she had gone to the county, things turned ugly fast. A notice appeared in her yard one morning, a bright yellow sign declaring her home under review for violations. It wasn't official, but it was public. Everyone walking by could see it. Neighbors stared. A few whispered. Carolyn passed by that evening, smiling faintly, as if to remind her who really held the power. But Evelyn was done being silent. She began documenting everything on video: the notices, the sign, the condition of her property. She gathered statements from the neighbors who had been harassed. And when the HOA finally filed their legal complaint, claiming she owed thousands in unpaid fines, she was ready. Her lawyer, a soft-spoken local attorney who had dealt with HOA abuse cases before, looked at the file and raised an eyebrow. They've overstepped. Badly. For the first time in months, Evelyn felt something close to hope. The case moved quickly to a preliminary hearing. The HOA expected her to back down, to fold under pressure. After all, most homeowners did. They counted on fear and exhaustion. But Evelyn wasn't backing down anymore. The night before the hearing, she sat on her porch watching the street lights flicker across the empty road. Bailey rested at her feet. The air was quiet, almost peaceful again. But she knew it was just the calm before the storm. She thought about everything that had happened. The flowers, the notes, the constant feeling of being watched. And she promised herself one thing. Whatever happened in that courtroom, she would make sure the truth came out. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every homeowner who had been bullied, silenced, or made to feel small in their own home. As the sun rose the next morning, she took a deep breath and gathered her binder full of evidence, the same one she had built through every sleepless night. When she walked into the courthouse, she wasn't the nervous homeowner from the first meeting anymore. She was ready for a fight. And by the end of it, everyone, including the HOA, would see just how far they'd gone too far. The courthouse smelled faintly of dust and old wood polish. the kind of scent that clings to places where people's lives are quietly reshaped. Evelyn sat near the front, her binder of evidence balanced on her lap. Around her, the small claims courtroom buzzed with low conversation. The HOA board had shown up in full force, 5 members in matching navy blazers, led by Carolyn, who looked every bit as confident as she did controlling. To anyone watching, it looked like a routine civil hearing, but to Evelyn, it felt like the end of a long, exhausting war. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. He was an older man with a calm but sharp gaze, the kind of person who could read the truth between words. The clerk called the case. Maple Ridge Homeowners Association versus Evelyn Harper. Carolyn rose immediately, carrying a thick stack of papers. Her tone was polite, even friendly, but there was a cold precision to it, the kind of tone that hides daggers behind smiles. She began outlining the HOA's complaint: repeated violations, unpaid fines, disregard for community standards. Each accusation was delivered like a rehearsed script, full of legal jargon designed to sound irrefutable. But the judge wasn't nodding along. He watched quietly, occasionally jotting a note, his expression unreadable. When Carolyn finally finished, she smiled slightly and gestured toward Evelyn. "We take no pleasure in this, but rules are rules, Your Honor. And homeowners who refuse to comply put the integrity of our community at risk." The judge looked up. "Thank you, Miss Simmons. Mrs. Harper, you may respond." Evelyn stood slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't trained for this. But she was prepared. She opened her binder. "Your Honor," she began, her voice trembling only slightly, "I love my home. I've worked my whole life to have it, and I've done everything I can to follow the community rules. But this isn't about rules anymore." She started laying out the timeline, one notice after another, each fine more unreasonable than the last. She described the flowers, the fence, the fake noise violations, the threats of liens. With every page she turned, she handed copies to the judge and opposing counsel. Her evidence wasn't dramatic, it was meticulous. Dates, letters, photos, even video of her property on the very days she was fined for non-compliance. The judge flipped through each page, his eyebrows narrowing slightly. When she got to the part about the late-night trespassing, the footprints, the open gate, she paused. She said, "I started feeling like I was being watched, not just by my neighbors, but by people who wanted to make me feel small, like I didn't belong in the place I worked so hard to call home." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even a few HOA members shifted uncomfortably. Then she turned to the final section, the financial irregularities. "This," she said, placing a photocopy on the table, "is a record of HOA expenses from last year. Landscaping, maintenance, and administrative fees. The signatures approving these payments? All the same person, Carolyn Simmons." The judge looked up sharply. "Is that true, Miss Simmons?" Carolyn stiffened. "Those were approved by the board, Your Honor, as standard operating procedure." Evelyn met the judge's gaze. "Except I spoke to 2 board members who said they never saw these invoices. And one of the contractors listed here doesn't exist. It's a shell company registered under a different name, the same P.O. box used for HOA correspondence." A tense silence filled the room. Carolyn's face drained of color. For the first time, the judge leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "That's a serious allegation, Mrs. Harper. Do you have proof?" Evelyn handed him another document, an email from the county registrar's office confirming the inactive business registration. The judge read it carefully. Then he looked up, his expression hardening. "What this association has done goes far beyond enforcing community guidelines." Carolyn's lawyer tried to intervene, mumbling about irrelevant evidence and procedural limits, but the judge raised a hand to silence him. "Mrs. Harper, please continue." Evelyn could feel the energy in the room shift. The power that once belonged to the HOA was slipping, one truth at a time. She spoke about how they ignored her appeals, how they refused to share bylaws, how they imposed fines that didn't exist in the governing documents. She quoted specific clauses that contradicted their own claims. And then she told the court about the neighbors, the ones too afraid to come forward. She showed their written statements, anonymized, but detailed. They spoke of fear, of intimidation, of feeling trapped in their own homes. When she finished, the judge sat silently for a long moment. Then, he turned to Carolyn. "Do you have a response?" Carolyn's composure cracked. "These are lies," she snapped. "This woman has been a problem since the day she moved in. She refuses to fit in. She disrespects the community." The judge raised an eyebrow. By planting flowers? The room broke into quiet laughter, the kind that comes when tension finally cracks. Carolyn's cheeks flushed deep red. "Order," the judge said, but even he couldn't completely suppress the faint smirk tugging at his lips. He flipped through the HOA's complaint once more, then closed the file. "I see no legal justification for these fines, these liens, or these so-called violations. What I do see," he said, his tone sharpening, "is a pattern of harassment and misuse of authority." Carolyn tried to speak again, but the judge continued, voice firm and final. "This court finds in favor of the defendant, Mrs. Harper. All fines are voided. Any lien or pending enforcement action is to be immediately withdrawn." He looked directly at Carolyn. "And I'm referring this matter to the county attorney's office for review of potential misconduct by this HOA board." Gasps echoed across the room. Evelyn didn't move. For a second, she couldn't. The words hung in the air, unreal and heavy. The months of fear, the sleepless nights, the constant anxiety, all of it felt like it was dissolving right there in that echoing courtroom. Carolyn's face was pale, her jaw tight. The rest of the board sat motionless, avoiding eye contact. The judge stood. "This hearing is concluded." The gavel came down with a sound that felt like thunder. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, brighter, lighter. Evelyn walked down the steps, binder still in hand, but for the first time, it didn't feel like armor. It felt like closure. Reporters from the local paper approached her asking about the case, about the HOA, about what she planned to do next. She just smiled softly. "I just want to go home," she said. As she drove back down Maple Ridge Drive, she noticed something. The yellow "Under Review" sign was gone from her yard. The street felt quiet again, not in that tense, watchful way, but in the peaceful way it had the day she moved in. But there was one thing left undone. At the next HOA election, several board members resigned. Carolyn tried to cling to her position, insisting she'd been misunderstood, but the community had seen too much. For the first time in years, the residents showed up, angry, united, and determined. A new board was elected. Transparency rules were introduced. Every dollar spent had to be publicly recorded. Evelyn didn't run for any position. She didn't need to. She'd already done her part. Still, sometimes at night, she'd sit on her porch with Bailey by her side, watching the breeze move gently through her new garden, the wildflowers blooming again, brighter than ever. And as she looked out over her peaceful street, one thought always came back to her, quiet but powerful. They tried to take her home. But instead, she took back her power. For the first few weeks after the court ruling, the neighborhood felt almost eerily quiet. No more warning letters, no new fines, no HOA representatives walking around with clipboards, snapping photos of mailbox heights or lawn edges. It was as if the entire street had exhaled, finally free of the constant pressure that had turned something as simple as owning a home into a slow, daily battle. Evelyn spent her mornings in the garden again, not hiding or worrying, but enjoying it. The wildflowers had started to bloom in waves of yellow and violet, swaying gently against the breeze. Bailey chased butterflies across the yard. For the first time since moving in, the sound of laughter returned. Her laughter. But peace didn't come instantly. Victory, Evelyn learned, doesn't erase what came before it. It transforms it. The HOA board's collapse sent ripples through the community. The county's review exposed what Evelyn had suspected: years of financial mismanagement hidden behind maintenance fees and improvement budgets. Several board members, including Carolyn, were cited for ethical violations and barred from serving on any association boards in the state for a period of years. The revelation stunned everyone. For years, homeowners had been quietly paying their dues, never questioning where the money went. It wasn't just Evelyn who had been targeted. It was anyone who had unknowingly stood in the way of Carolyn's little kingdom. When the truth came out, neighbors who once avoided Evelyn began stopping by her gate to talk. Some apologized. Others thanked her. "I wanted to speak up," one man admitted, "but I was afraid they'd come after me next." Evelyn didn't hold it against them. She understood that kind of fear. The slow erosion of confidence when a small group of people make you believe your voice doesn't matter. But that was over now. A month after the court ruling, the community gathered in the clubhouse, the same place where Evelyn had once been humiliated for planting flowers. This time, the energy was completely different. There was no tension, no sense of hierarchy. People were talking, laughing, even helping rearrange chairs. A new board had been elected. Younger, more transparent, more open. Their first motion was to rewrite the HOA bylaws entirely, stripping away the vague language that allowed abuse to flourish. When they reached the section about landscaping uniformity, someone in the crowd jokingly suggested renaming it the Evelyn Clause. The room erupted in laughter, and even Evelyn couldn't help but smile. The new rules were simple: reasonable guidelines, mutual respect, and accountability for everyone, including board members. Evelyn didn't speak much at the meeting. She didn't need to. Just being there, sitting quietly in the back as the community took its first real steps toward healing, was enough. But something unexpected happened a few weeks later. A letter arrived in her mailbox. Not a warning time, not a notice or a threat, just a plain white envelope with a handwritten note inside. "Thank you," it said. "Because of you, I didn't sell my house." It was signed by Sandra, one of the neighbors who had faced harassment for painting her shutters the wrong shade of blue. She'd been ready to move away, tired of fighting, but seeing Evelyn stand her ground had changed her mind. That letter hit Evelyn harder than any court ruling or apology, because for the first time, she saw the full impact of what she'd done, not just for herself, but for everyone who'd ever felt powerless in their own home. As months passed, life on Maple Ridge Drive began to look like the neighborhood it had always pretended to be. Not perfect, not uniform, but real. Kids rode bikes down the street without parents worrying about, quote, noise violations. Homeowners planted gardens in their own styles, some neat and trimmed, others bursting with wild color. The air felt lighter, the smiles genuine, and slowly people began to reclaim what had been taken from them, the simple joy of living without fear. One afternoon, while watering her flowers, Evelyn noticed a car she didn't recognize slowing down near her driveway. It was Carolyn. Her hair was shorter now, and her posture less rigid. She looked tired, not defeated exactly, but smaller somehow, as if the weight of her own choices had finally settled in. For a long moment, neither woman moved. Then Carolyn lowered her window slightly. "I heard you kept the flowers," she said quietly. Evelyn nodded. "They make me happy." There was a pause. Carolyn's eyes flickered toward the garden, then back to Evelyn. "They're beautiful," she murmured. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was something. A crack in the armor of someone who had built their identity on control. Evelyn simply smiled. They always were. Carolyn drove away without another word. And just like that, the last ghost of the past drifted down the street and disappeared.
By the end of the year, the story of Evelyn's case had spread beyond Maple Ridge. Local news outlets ran features on it, calling it a victory for homeowners' rights. Online forums discussed it as an example of how HOAs could be challenged and how ordinary people could win. But Evelyn never saw herself as a hero. She was just a woman who refused to be bullied out of her home. And in her quiet way, she'd done something extraordinary. She'd reminded people that standing up, even when you're scared, can ripple farther than you ever imagine. Every spring after that, she made a point to plant something new in her garden, not just for decoration, but as a reminder that growth always comes after struggle, that roots only get stronger when the storm passes. The neighbors started joining in too. Soon, every yard on the block had its own burst of color. Some said it made the neighborhood look less uniform. Evelyn thought it finally looked alive. On the anniversary of the court ruling, the community held a small celebration. Nothing formal, just a potluck at the clubhouse. Kids ran around with balloons, and someone played old country music on a Bluetooth speaker. At one point, one of the new board members stood and raised a glass. To Evelyn Harper, the woman who reminded us what community really means. Everyone cheered. Evelyn blushed, shaking her head, but she couldn't stop smiling. In that moment, surrounded by laughter, music, and the warmth of neighbors who had once been strangers, she realized something simple but profound. The HOA had once tried to strip her of belonging. Now she'd helped everyone find it again. That night, sitting on her porch as the sun dipped below the rooftops, she thought about how much had changed, not just for her, but for all of them. She thought about how fear had ruled their lives, how silence had let injustice grow, and how one act of courage, even a small one, could turn everything around. And she wondered how many other people in other neighborhoods were still living under that same kind of quiet oppression. Her story had gone viral online, and she'd started receiving emails from homeowners all over the country, people sharing their own experiences with overreaching HOAs, people asking for advice, people just saying thank you. One message stood out. It was from a woman in another state, dealing with almost the same nightmare. Her email ended with a single line, "I don't know what to do, but your story gave me hope." Evelyn stared at that sentence for a long time. Then she smiled and wrote back, "Don't let them scare you. You have more power than you think." The wildflowers rustled in the night breeze as she hit send. It was strange, she thought, how something as small as a few flowers could start a war and how that same symbol could end up meaning freedom. As she stood and looked out over the quiet, peaceful street, a thought settled in her chest, clear and calm, like the moment before dawn. Sometimes it only takes one person to break the silence. Sometimes it takes one voice to remind a whole neighborhood what home really means. She didn't fight just to win a case. She fought to remind people that their homes, their peace, were worth defending. And that's the truth about power. It doesn't belong to those who take it. It belongs to those brave enough to stand their ground.
It started with a letter taped to my door. A warning from the HOA claiming I'd violated community standards. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was a mistake. But within weeks, the warnings turned into threats, and the threats turned into something darker. My mailbox was filled with fines, my driveway marked for inspection, and neighbors I'd known for years suddenly avoided eye contact. By the time I realized what was really happening, it was too late. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were trying to take my home. But why me? And how far would they go? For most people, home is more than just four walls. It's promise of peace, stability, and safety. That's exactly what Evelyn Harper thought she was getting when she bought her dream house on Maple Ridge Drive, a quiet, tree-lined street tucked inside a so-called exclusive HOA community. At first, it felt like everything she had ever wanted. Neighbors waved when she drove by, the lawns were perfectly trimmed, and the air carried that faint smell of fresh-cut grass and morning coffee. Evelyn had spent years working double shifts as a nurse to afford this home.
The kind of place where she could finally slow down, garden on weekends, and sit on the porch with her dog Bailey. The HOA brushers had promised a harmonious, well-maintained neighborhood. Rules, they said, were there to protect property values and preserve community beauty. Evelyn liked that. After all, who wouldn't want to live in a place where everyone cared about keeping things nice? But what those glossy brochures didn't say, what they never say, is how quickly rules can turn into weapons, and how a few people with too much time and too little empathy can twist them for power. It started small. A few months after moving in, Evelyn received her first HOA notice, a polite reminder about trash can placement. Apparently, she'd left hers visible from the street for more than 24 hours. She paid the small fine without a second thought, even laughed about it with a coworker later. But she started noticing things after that. Subtle changes. A few neighbors who once smiled now looked away. The HOA president, a sharp-tongued woman named Carolyn, began showing up unannounced at homes, clipboard in hand, inspecting yards as if she owned them. Evelyn brushed it off until Carolyn stopped in front of her house one morning and stood there for several minutes, staring at her garden like it had personally offended her. Evelyn had planted bright wildflowers by her mailbox, small splashes of color she loved, but the HOA landscaping guidelines were strict. Uniform greenery, they called it. Nothing distracting from the neighborhood aesthetic.